Here's what Howie Roseman said yesterday about drafting a running back.
We studied this. There's this narrative that you can get running backs in the 5th, 6th, 7th round and undrafted free agency. When you look back at the last 10 years of guys who are really in the top 10 in rushing, those guys are high picks. And so when you find the special talent at that position, that guy who can run the ball, who can pass protect, who can catch the ball out of the backfield, that's a unique weapon. And so I don't think the position is devalued. You know, talking to Doug, and obviously we come from the same school of Andy and what he can do with those kind of guys. And we talk about Ryan and Darren. Obviously, you have them, but when you go back and really look at it, and I had some time over the fall to be able to do that, you see that really it is hard to get guys later.
So I wanted to play the full clip, John, because sometimes we've heard on different places kind of like a shortened version of that, not within the full context. So I wanted to get your reaction to the full statement from Howie about the potential of drafting a running back in the draft this year.
Well, I think it's that time of year. It's silly season. It's lying season. It's deflection season. And, you know, Howie has talked about the draft as a whole, and every year you have tiers in the draft, and the Eagles believe that this year's draft, there's a big drop-off from 10 to 11. So they believe there are 10 players that are rated above all else, and then there's a pretty significant drop-off to that second tier. And that's why it was so important to work out that deal with Miami, which enabled them to flip from 13 to 8, because now they're in the wheelhouse and can get one of those players. Now, obviously, when you talk about a running back in this draft, you're talking about Ezekiel Elliott from Ohio State, who's a pretty good prospect. Is he a top 10 prospect? I don't believe so. He is a first-round draft choice. He will be chosen in the first round. But I think a lot of his talk is trying to create interest, because if some team does want Elliott that high, all of a sudden that gives you a chance to get another option that you really want into the equation. I think that's what Howie's doing. He knows better than anyone else that the position's been devalued. There's no denying that as far as the NFL goes. When you have a generational talent like Adrian Peterson, or a lot of people think Todd Gurley is, that's a different question. I don't believe Ezekiel Elliott is that type of player, and I don't believe Howie Roseman thinks so either.
So you feel like some of this is posturing. So what would be the point, though, if the Eagles were to move up to 8 and then get a potential a suitor who wanted the 8 slot and then potentially move down? Would that just be to get another second-round pick?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure they'd love to add that second-round pick back, and their philosophy, certainly Howie's philosophy, differed a bit from Chip's in the fact that they want as many draft choices as they can possibly get, not only in the second round, but, you know, it could be a 7th, 6th-round pick, 5th-round pick. You can get contributors all up and down the draft, and they'd love to add more picks. I don't think they want to move down from number 8. It's one of those things that people ask questions. Obviously, if you look at this roster, there's a hole at the running back position. DeMarco Murray's gone. Ryan Matthews has a significant history of injury. There's been talk that the Eagles want to trade him on top of it. So I don't think you look at Ryan Matthews and say, this is the guy who's going to handle the football 25 times a game. So by that thought process, you need a new starting running back. And then it enters the equation, well, this is a weakness on your team, so would you consider it at number 8 overall? Again, if it were Adrian Peterson, yeah, they'd consider it. But for Ezekiel Elliott, I don't think they would. And Howie was just trying to deflect, and as a lot of GMs do this time of year when you start talking about potential draft choices.
Talk with John McMullen. You can follow his work over at 97.3 ESPN.com. He's our Eagles insider. Also covers the NFL nationally for today's Pigskin and FanRagSports.com. John, Jeffrey Lurie spoke down in Florida today. Today's the NFL's owners' meetings this week, and I wanted to get your reaction overall because, we can nitpick what Lurie said here and there, but, he talked about Sam Bradford. He talked about Doug Peterson. He talked about how happy he is with Bradford and Daniels, but it seemed like a lot of what he said was kind of predictable.
Well, yeah, there's not much you can do after you're coming off a season which you fired a coach. And remember, it's really a calendar year is all it took. Once Jeffrey Lurie gave Chip Kelly the keys to the castle, so to speak. So that's a very short amount of time to all of a sudden hit Control, Alt, Delete on your franchise and reboot again. So you have to spin it the best way possible. I don't think Jeffrey Lurie kind of wrote about it today on the site at 973ESPN.com. I don't think people have looked at Jeffrey Lurie enough. A lot of the blame goes directly to him for this entire situation because the Eagles lost a year out of their lives, basically, that they're never getting back. Because when Chip Kelly pulled the original power play, Jeffrey Lurie kind of intimated that he knew he wasn't ready for it, but instead of acting on that and calling Chip Kelly's bluff, he gave him all the power he wanted simply to prove the accountability, as he says, and either he would do it or not, and then he could move on. Well, you're the owner of this football team. You don't need to prove anything. If you think he wasn't ready for that job, show the courage of your convictions and say, no, Howie Roseman's going to be my personnel guy. If you want to coach this team, fine. But if not, we're going to move in a different direction, and then the Eagles wouldn't have lost 365 days, basically.
Do you think if Jeffrey Lurie could go back and do it over again, he would? Or do you think it's one of those things where he doesn't really think like that?
Oh, no question he would. No question he would stand up and say exactly what I just said, and he would put it to Chip in that way. It's not that he was trying to move on from the coach at that particular time. He was just much more comfortable with the organizational structure before Chip grabbed all the football power, and that was Howie handling the personnel aspect, Chip handling the coaching, and he would have final say over the 53-man roster. Jeffrey was very comfortable with that. I think if it would have moved forward in that direction, I think Chip Kelly would still be here and be the head coach of this football team. So I don't think there's any doubt if he goes back to that day, he would have followed his conscience and told Chip, this is the way it's going to be. Now, at that particular time, Josh, if Chip Kelly walks away and resigns, that's a possibility, but that's something you have to live with. And I believe if he could do it over, if he had a mulligan, Jeffrey Lurie would handle it that way.
I wanted to ask you, from a national perspective, about Jeffrey Lurie. What is the view around from other owners, from the NFL as a whole, of the Eagles and Lurie?
It was very good until January of 2015. It's taken a big hit since then. There's no question about that. I think when Andy Reid was here, I think people looked upon this organization. Jeffrey always gets killed for the gold standard comment. And they're certainly not the gold standard, but they were considered to be one of the 4 or 5 best run organizations in professional football. I think that reputation's taken a large hit, not necessarily because of Andy Reid and how things ended there. All coaches have a shelf life, and Andy was here for so long. It's almost, you can almost expect at some point people are going to stop sort of listening to that voice, and you need a change. But there's the Chip Kelly era certainly harmed the reputation of this organization around this league as a whole. And that's why they're trying, as I always say, to go back to the future, so to speak, and trying to recreate what they had for so many years, except this time it's going to be Howie Roseman and not Andy Reid, but Howie Roseman and sort of an Andy Reid acolyte and Doug Peterson.
We're talking with John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN.com Eagles insider. He also covers the NFL nationally for today's Pigskin and I always have trouble saying this, John. FanRagSports.com.
That's the parent company of today's Pigskin. So you can just say today'spigskin.com.
So I wanted to ask you about a couple NFL things. At the owners' meetings, which is where Jeff Lurie is in Florida, which apparently was very windy yesterday if you watched any coverage on TV, they voted to get rid of the chop block, and they actually expanded the definition of exactly what a chop block is. So it seems like the NFL is now taking a little bit of a weapon away from the offenses under the guise of player safety.
Yeah, and it makes sense because that's been sort of the dogma of this league has been safety. But one thing I've always criticized, and this goes both ways, not only from the league standpoint, but also from the people who kind of push this safety-based agenda. When you hear that word safety, to this point, it's always been about concussions and concussions only. And I don't know if you remember the Baltimore St. Louis Rams game this year, Josh, but the Rams got in a lot of trouble, Jeff Fisher specifically, because Case Keenum was pretty you could see visually he had gotten a concussion. They left him in the game, and they sort of got a lot of criticism. But on that same game, Joe Flacco tore his ACL and finished. And it was pretty clear he could barely move, and he was limping around, and nobody cared. Nobody cared. They just said Joe's the toughest guy in the world. But if you think about safety as a whole, well, if you got a torn ACL, we have a safety issue if you're still on the football field. And the fact that the NFL is still is finally addressing something like shot blocks, which defensive linemen in this league have been calling for years and years and years, because there's been so many knee injuries directly related to chop blocks. The fact that they finally got it done today speaks that they're finally opening up this vision of safety past just concussion.
The NFL also, a couple other things they did today, they increased communication from sideline to the booth. Basically now there can be more conversation between players and coaches. They can communicate freely. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what went into that decision?
Well, as technology advances, you always revisit this stuff. One of the issues, and everyone will look toward the Patriots, is you have these sort of things that happen in the heat of the game, where one team's the communication ability will magically be jammed, and they won't be able to communicate with their players. The other team can. That's been one of those things that's been a sort of a home field advantage, these hinky things happening. And the Patriots aren't the only team, but they're the ones that everyone always points at. So as it gets more structurally sound, the ability to have this communication, it just makes more sense to do it and to have it more freewheeling. And we'll see how it works out, because one thing we know about this league is it's win above all else. And people will look for any minute advantage. And if that means somehow tinkering with the communication ability of the visiting team, the NFL is going to have something to address down the road. But if they can work it out, it'll only help the game as a whole, because the more communication you have, it's best for the teams.
And, of course, the other rule they implemented was they are making permanent where the extra points are, making it basically a 33-yard try for the extra point. I think that was pretty much assumed to be going down, right, John?
Yeah, it was. I'm not a big fan of the change in the rule to begin with, but once they implemented it, you kind of knew, even though they said they were going to revisit it after a season, you knew it was going to sort of be a rubber stamp, and that was the way they were going to do things moving forward. I think the original intent of it was to encourage more 2-point plays, but that never really materialized, and all of a sudden you have this goofy extra point from the 15-yard line. And I don't know. It's a more competitive football play. Certainly it's more difficult. Kickers had more issues making extra points, which makes sense, but I don't think there was that much of a difference where it added something to the game. So that was one of those rules where I looked at and said, there's not really a lot of need for it, but that's what we talked about a little bit yesterday. The NFL is prone to over-legislate. I think that's another example of it.
The NFL looks like they're still going to be having their meetings for the next couple of days. Can we expect anything else coming out of the owners' meetings this week, John?
Well, the biggest as far as rule changes was the two unsportsmanlike foul call rule where you would be immediately ejected. That hasn't been approved yet. It was expected to be, and I still think it will be, but there's more talk going on. And also replay is always a fluid situation because we talked about the technology aspect. As you get better views from cameras, higher definition, they have to do a better job of figuring out a way where they can do it instantaneously. There's been talk of adding another official to the crew, but that official would be up in the booth and could communicate with the on-field officials in real time. Maybe that would improve replay. So they're always looking to do things like that. And probably the last thing is international expansion because that's high on the NFL's list. There's talk about having a game in China. There's talk about having a game in Germany. They're going to Mexico City this year. Obviously London for 3 games. So that is high on the agenda because Roger Goodell, I wrote about it today. You go back 5 or 6 years at these very spring meetings, and he talked about by 2027, he said this was going to be a $25 billion a year industry. And they're well on their way because they made $12 billion last year. But to do that, they have to open up other markets. This one is just tapped out. It's pretty much maxed out. And they're going to have to open up emerging markets in every business, whether it's sports or just finance, anything, wants to get into China, and the NFL is no different.
John, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about the Cowboys made a couple moves in the last 24 hours. They brought in Alfred Morris, and they also brought in Benson Mayowa. And while some people may be like, well, those aren't very significant moves, I think it actually says a lot about what the Cowboys think they need to do. And they do have the 4th pick in the draft, and there's some conjecture that they may go after Joey Bosa at that pick because they're not going to bring back Greg Hardy. I wanted to get your reaction about the Cowboys' moves and the potential of what their plans are moving forward.
Well, I think their best move is the fact that they stayed away from Johnny Manziel, at least initially.
I think that would be a good move for anybody, John.
But it was assumed that Jerry Jones was going to jump as soon as he could, and the fact that Steven probably talked him out of it is a good way to move forward. And they still might do it down the line. This is the Dallas Cowboys. You mentioned Greg Hardy. I still believe he's going to end up on the Cowboys because they're in desperate need of pass rushers. Randy Gregory's already suspended, and he wasn't good last year when he did play. They desperately need pass rushers, and if they get him back on a 1-year deal that's very cost-effective, I still think that might be something that could happen. And certainly they are going to get him on a team-friendly deal because there isn't a lot of interest in him around the league. John Harbaugh today said, I'm not interested. He's not going to be a Raven. So that gives you sort of the kind of reputation he has around football, and the Cowboys have always shown an inclination to go after those players. You mentioned Joey Bosa. He's a possibility at number 4 overall. Remember, he did not take his drug test at the Combine because he knew he would fail for Adderall. And he's admitted that, so that's an issue. That's a red flag you have to put out. Alfred Morris is a decent running back. They need a guy who is sort of capable of handling the football a lot, because you certainly can't count on a Darren McFadden to do that year after year after year. But he's kind of a one-trick pony. He's a decent runner, but he can't catch the ball out of the backfield. He's not a very good pass blocker. I think the Cowboys have a lot of issues on both sides of the football, and really they center on their belief is they're a contender if Tony Romo's healthy. But if you think about all the injuries, all the back trouble, and the fact that he's aging and the collarbone now, to count on him to play 16 games is probably not the best thing to do. So there's a lot of holes the Dallas Cowboys have to kind of fill in as we get closer to the draft, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to do it.
You can follow John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter. He also writes for 97.3 ESPN.com and also covers the NFL nationally for today's Pigskin. John, appreciate you coming on the show, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.
Hey, thanks, Jess.